The first pale light of dawn crept through the gaps in the boarded windows of the abandoned farmhouse, casting long shadows across the dusty floor where 5 survivors huddled together, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Marcus Chin wiped sweat from his brow as he checked his watch. 5:47 a.m., and already they could hear the telltale moans echoing from the distance, growing steadily closer like a tide of death approaching their fragile sanctuary. The former army medic's trained ears could distinguish at least 15 distinct voices in that horrible chorus, maybe more, and his stomach clenched with the realization that their latest safe house had been compromised during the night. Sarah Mitchell, once a beloved third-grade teacher in suburban Denver, clutched her tattered backpack against her chest and whispered a prayer she wasn't sure anyone was listening to anymore, her gentle brown eyes reflecting the terror that had become their constant companion over the past 3 months since the outbreak began. David Rodriguez emerged from beneath their makeshift shelter, a reinforced corner of the farmhouse where they'd spent the night, his mechanic's coverall stained with grease and zombie blood, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he delivered the news they'd all been dreading. "The truck's been damaged," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the growing chorus of undead moans. "Looks like they got to it during the night, tore up the engine compartment pretty bad. I might be able to fix it, but it's gonna take time we don't have." Emma Santos, barely 17 but aged beyond her years by the horrors she'd witnessed, peered through a crack in the boarded window and felt her heart sink as she counted the shambling figures emerging from the morning mist that clung to the abandoned farmland surrounding their refuge. Old Pete Kowalski, the retired trucker whose knowledge of back roads and hidden routes had kept them alive for weeks, adjusted his worn baseball cap and studied the hand-drawn map spread across the dusty table, his finger tracing the route they'd planned to take toward the rumored safe zone called Haven, somewhere high in the Rocky Mountains where other survivors claimed the dead couldn't reach. The farmhouse groaned ominously as the weight of pressing bodies began to strain against the wooden boards they'd hastily nailed across the windows and doors the night before, and Marcus made a quick inventory of their remaining supplies: 3 cans of beans, a half-empty water bottle, Emma's hunting knife, his medical kit, and David's toolbox containing their only weapons: a crowbar, a hammer, and a rusty machete Pete had found in the barn. Sarah's teaching instincts kicked in as she began organizing their meager belongings with practiced efficiency, her movements calm and methodical despite the chaos threatening to overwhelm them from outside, while David frantically worked on the truck's engine, his skilled hands moving with desperate precision as he attempted to bypass the damaged components and restore their means of escape. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the farmhouse as the first zombie broke through one of the weakened boards, its decaying fingers clawing at the gap while its dead eyes fixed on the movement within, and Marcus knew they had minutes, maybe less, before their sanctuary became their tomb. "We go on foot," Marcus announced, his military training taking over as he assumed command of their desperate situation. "Through the cornfield, heading west toward the main highway. David, grab what tools you can carry. Sarah, stay close to Emma. Pete, you know these roads better than anyone. Can you get us to the next town?" The old trucker nodded grimly, folding the map and stuffing it into his jacket pocket as more boards began to splinter under the relentless assault of the undead horde. Emma's hands shook as she gathered her few possessions, accidentally knocking over an old oil lamp that crashed to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire farmhouse. And in that moment of crushing silence that followed, they all realized the same terrible truth: the noise had attracted every zombie within hearing distance, and their location was now completely exposed. The moaning outside intensified, joined by the sound of running feet and excited snarls as the creatures pressed against every entrance, and Marcus gripped his crowbar tighter as he prepared to lead his makeshift family into the corn maze beyond, knowing that their survival depended on a plan that was equal parts desperate courage and blind luck. The explosion of splintering wood behind them propelled the 5 survivors through the farmhouse's back door and into the towering cornfield that stretched endlessly in every direction, the yellowing stalks rising above their heads like a natural fortress that promised both protection and peril in equal measure. Marcus led the way, his military compass clutched tightly in his left hand while his right gripped the crowbar that had already saved their lives more times than he cared to count, his boots crushing the dry earth as he navigated the narrow pathways between the corn rows with practiced precision. Behind him, Sarah struggled to keep pace, her breathing labored and her ankle throbbing from where she twisted it stepping into a hidden irrigation ditch that had been concealed by fallen leaves and debris, but she bit back her pain and pushed forward, knowing that any sign of weakness could doom them all. The sound of the farmhouse being overrun echoed through the field, the crash of breaking glass, the splintering of wood, and the triumphant moans of the undead horde as they discovered their prey had escaped. But Marcus knew it would only be minutes before the creatures picked up their scent and began following them into the maze. David brought up the rear, his toolbox clanging softly against his hip as he constantly checked over his shoulder for signs of pursuit, while Emma stayed close to Sarah, her young eyes scanning the corn rows for any sign of movement or danger that might be lurking in the shadows between the towering stalks. Old Pete moved with surprising agility for his age, his knowledge of farming country proving invaluable as he identified the subtle differences between the planted rows and the natural paths that crisscrossed the field, guiding them toward what he hoped would be the western edge where they might find another road or at least more defensible ground. The field seemed endless, a labyrinth of golden stalks that rustled ominously in the morning breeze, and more than once they heard the distant sound of something large moving through the corn parallel to their path, though whether it was zombie or survivor remained a terrifying mystery that none of them were eager to solve. Sarah's ankle gave out completely when they were roughly halfway through the field, and she collapsed against a thick corn stalk with a muffled cry of pain that sent a chill through the entire group, knowing that any sound could attract the attention of the creatures they were desperately trying to avoid. David immediately moved to help her, his strong arms supporting her weight as Marcus made the difficult decision to slow their pace, even though every instinct screamed at him to keep moving before the zombies found their trail. It was then that they heard voices, human voices, coming from deeper in the field, and for a moment hope flared in their hearts until they realized that the voices were wrong somehow, slurred and inhuman, carrying an undertone of hunger that made their blood run cold. Emma was the first to spot them through the corn stalks. A family of 3, a man, woman, and teenage boy, who had once been survivors like themselves but now bore the telltale signs of infection, the pale, mottled skin, the black veins visible beneath the surface, and the terrible bite marks on their necks and arms that told the story of their final moments as living beings. The infected family moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of the recently turned, still retaining enough of their human intelligence to be far more dangerous than the mindless creatures that had overrun the farmhouse, and Marcus realized with growing horror that they were being hunted by zombies who could think, plan, and anticipate their moves. The chase that followed was a nightmare of twisting paths and dead ends, with the group desperately trying to outmaneuver their pursuers while Sarah fought through the agony of her injured ankle, supported by David's unwavering strength and Emma's fierce determination to protect the woman who had become like a mother to her. Pete's knowledge of the field proved their salvation as he led them through a series of increasingly narrow pathways that the larger infected family members couldn't navigate, finally bringing them to the edge of the cornfield just as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. But as they emerged from the corn maze, battered and exhausted, they found themselves completely lost in unfamiliar territory, with no landmarks to guide them and no way of knowing which direction would lead them closer to safety or deeper into danger. In the distance, barely visible through the gathering dusk, they could see lights twinkling like stars fallen to earth, and Marcus felt his heart torn between hope and dread as he realized they would have to make a choice that could mean the difference between salvation and walking straight into another trap that would make their previous ordeals seem like a pleasant memory. The distant lights that had beckoned them through the darkness led the weary survivors to what had once been a bustling highway rest stop, now transformed into a makeshift fortress where the glow of campfires and battery-powered lanterns created an oasis of warmth and apparent safety in the zombie-infested wasteland that America had become. Marcus approached cautiously, his hand resting on his crowbar as he studied the layout of the encampment, noting the strategically placed vehicles that formed defensive barriers and the armed sentries who watched their approach with expressions that seemed more predatory than welcoming. The rest stop's main building had been reinforced with sheets of metal and wooden planks, its windows replaced with gun ports, while the parking area had been cleared of abandoned cars and converted into a central gathering space where roughly 30 survivors of various ages huddled around fires, their faces bearing the haunted expressions of people who had seen too much death and lost too much hope. Sarah limped forward, supported by David's steady arm, her injured ankle now swollen and throbbing with each step, but she forced herself to maintain a composed exterior as a tall man in a tattered police uniform emerged from the main building to greet them. Officer Rodriguez, as he introduced himself, wore his authority like armor, his badge still pinned to his chest despite the fact that the law he had once sworn to uphold had crumbled along with civilization itself, and his smile was too wide, too practiced, carrying an undertone of calculation that made Marcus's combat instincts flare to life. "Welcome to our little sanctuary," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to command, "but I'm afraid we have rules here, strict ones that everyone must follow if they want to enjoy our protection and share our resources." The rules, as Rodriguez explained them while leading the group toward the main building, were simple but harsh. Everyone contributed according to their abilities, no one questioned leadership decisions, and anyone who showed signs of infection was immediately expelled from the camp, regardless of circumstances or personal relationships. Pete studied the other survivors with the shrewd eyes of someone who had spent decades reading people on the road, and he didn't like what he saw in their hollow expressions and the way they avoided eye contact, their movements carrying the nervous energy of people living in constant fear of their own protectors. Emma noticed that many of the camp's residents were women and children, while most of the armed guards were men who looked well-fed and confident, a disparity that spoke to power dynamics that made her stomach turn with remembered experiences she preferred not to dwell upon. During their first night in the camp, as they huddled together in a corner of the main building that had been designated as temporary quarters for newcomers, Marcus learned from whispered conversations with other survivors that the highway ahead was completely blocked by what locals called the graveyard, a massive pileup of abandoned vehicles stretching for miles in both directions, creating an impenetrable barrier that had trapped thousands of refugees when the outbreak reached its peak. The survivors who had been in the camp longest spoke in hushed tones about Rodriguez's expeditions into the graveyard, ostensibly to scavenge for supplies and fuel, but the details they shared about these missions were vague and troubling, filled with references to necessary sacrifices and hard choices that had to be made for the greater good of the community. David's mechanical expertise quickly drew Rodriguez's attention, and the self-appointed leader made it clear that skilled workers were valuable commodities in their new world order, while those who couldn't contribute meaningfully were considered expendable resources that could be used in other ways. The true nature of the camp's operation became horrifyingly clear when Emma disappeared during their second night, vanishing from her sleeping bag without a trace while the others slept fitfully nearby, and Marcus realized with growing dread that their apparent salvation was actually an elaborate trap designed to lure desperate survivors into a web of exploitation and horror. Sarah's teaching background made her valuable for managing the camp's children, but she noticed that many of the younger survivors bore the hollow-eyed look of people who had been broken by experiences that went far beyond simple zombie encounters. As Marcus searched frantically for any trace of Emma, questioning other survivors who either couldn't or wouldn't provide answers, he began to understand that Rodriguez's operation was built on a foundation of human predation that was perhaps more monstrous than anything the zombie apocalypse had unleashed. The choice facing them now was stark and terrible. They could confront Rodriguez and his followers, risking their lives in a battle they might not win, or they could abandon Emma to whatever fate awaited her and continue their journey toward the uncertain promise of haven, carrying the weight of that betrayal for whatever remained of their lives in this new world where humanity's greatest enemy might not be the walking dead, but the moral decay that had infected the hearts of the living. The pre-dawn hours found Marcus, Sarah, David, and Pete crouched behind a rusted semi-trailer at the edge of the vehicle graveyard, their hearts pounding as they surveyed the twisted maze of abandoned cars, trucks, and buses that stretched endlessly across the highway like a metallic graveyard of America's final exodus. The maze was even more horrifying than Rodriguez's people had described, thousands of vehicles packed so tightly together that they formed walls of twisted metal and shattered glass, their doors hanging open like screaming mouths, their interiors dark with stains that told stories of panic, desperation, and death that had occurred during those final chaotic days when civilization collapsed. David's trained eye immediately began cataloging the mechanical possibilities hidden within the graveyard, noting which vehicles might still have functional engines or useful parts, while Marcus studied the strategic challenges of navigating the maze without alerting the zombies that Rodriguez's people claimed patrolled the area in organized packs. The truth about Rodriguez's operation became sickeningly clear as they watched from their hiding place. A group of his men were leading 3 terrified survivors deeper into the graveyard, their hands zip-tied behind their backs, their eyes wide with the knowledge of what was about to happen to them. The survivors were being used as human bait, deliberately positioned in areas where their screams would attract zombies away from the paths that Rodriguez's scavenging teams needed to use, a system of calculated murder that allowed the rest stops residents to harvest supplies from the vehicles while the undead fed on the flesh of innocent people who had trusted them with their lives. Pete's weathered face contorted with rage as he watched the scene unfold, his hands clenching into fists as he remembered his own granddaughter who had been Emma's age when the outbreak began, and he whispered a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush while Marcus formulated a desperate plan to rescue Emma from the school bus they could see in the distance, its yellow paint faded and streaked with rust but still visible among the darker vehicles that surrounded it. Sarah's ankle was still tender, but she insisted on being part of the rescue mission, her maternal instincts overriding her physical limitations as she watched Emma through a pair of binoculars they'd found in an abandoned police cruiser, the teenager's small form visible through the bus's rear window where she sat with her hands bound, surrounded by what appeared to be other captives who were being held for future expeditions into the graveyard. David's mechanical expertise became their greatest asset as he hotwired a series of vehicles throughout the maze, creating a complex network of alarms and diversions that would allow them to move through the graveyard without being detected by either Rodriguez's men or the zombie patrols that shambled between the wrecked cars like undead sentinels guarding a metallic necropolis. The rescue operation began at dawn, with Pete creating the first distraction by setting off a car alarm 3 blocks away from the school bus, drawing a horde of zombies toward the sound while Marcus and Sarah approached from the opposite direction, their movements careful and calculated as they navigated between vehicles whose occupants had died in their seats, their skeletal remains still clutching steering wheels or reaching toward doors they would never open. David worked frantically to disable the locks on the school bus while keeping watch for Rodriguez's guards, his skilled hands making quick work of the mechanical systems that kept Emma and the other prisoners trapped inside. But their plan began to unravel when one of the captives, a middle-aged man named Collins, panicked and began screaming for help, his voice echoing through the graveyard and alerting every zombie within a mile radius to their location. The escape that followed was a nightmare of grinding metal and shattering glass as the group fought their way through the maze while being pursued by an ever-growing horde of zombies that had been drawn by the commotion, their rotting hands reaching through broken windows to grab at the fleeing survivors while their dead eyes reflected a hunger that could never be satisfied. Emma proved her courage by taking charge of the other rescued prisoners, leading them through gaps in the vehicle maze that only someone her size could navigate, while Marcus and David used their makeshift weapons to clear a path toward the functional RV that David had spotted earlier, its engine still capable of running despite months of abandonment. The sound of approaching footsteps and Rodriguez's angry shouts added human predators to their list of immediate threats, and it was then that old Pete made the ultimate sacrifice, positioning himself between the group and their pursuers with nothing but a tire iron and a determination to ensure that the people he had come to love would live to see another day, his final act of defiance buying them the precious seconds they needed to reach the RV and escape into the wasteland beyond, though. None of them would ever forget the sound of his final battle echoing through the graveyard as they drove away into an uncertain future. The stolen RV rumbled westward through the desolate landscape for 3 days, its engine coughing and sputtering as David nursed it along cracked highways lined with abandoned vehicles and sun-bleached skeletons, while the 4 survivors grieved for Pete in their own ways, his empty seat serving as a constant reminder of the price they had paid for their freedom from Rodriguez's nightmare camp. Marcus drove in silence, his military training keeping him focused on the road ahead while his heart struggled with the weight of leadership and the knowledge that every decision he made could mean the difference between life and death for the people who had become his family in this broken world. Sarah sat beside Emma, both women taking turns reading from a water-damaged paperback novel they had found in the RV's glove compartment, the familiar act of storytelling providing a brief escape from the horrors that surrounded them, while David worked constantly to keep their vehicle running, his mechanical expertise the thin line between mobility and becoming stranded in the wasteland that stretched endlessly in all directions. The river, when they finally reached it, was a sight that filled them with both hope and dread, a wide expanse of brown water that marked the boundary between the eastern deadlands they had escaped and the western territories where Haven supposedly waited. But the bridge that had once carried thousands of travelers safely across had been partially destroyed, its twisted metal framework rising from the water like the bones of some prehistoric monster. On the eastern bank, a makeshift dock had been constructed from salvaged materials, and tied to it was a rusty ferry operated by a woman who introduced herself as Captain Torres, her weathered face marked by scars that spoke of countless encounters with both the living and the dead, her eyes holding the calculating look of someone who had learned to profit from other people's desperation. The price she demanded for passage was steep, not just their remaining supplies and fuel, but also their labor, requiring each passenger to work as crew during the crossing, a demand that Marcus found suspicious but had little choice but to accept. While they waited for the ferry to be prepared for departure, other refugee groups began arriving at the dock, creating a small community of desperate survivors who shared stories of the horrors they had escaped and the hopes they carried for the promised safety that lay beyond the river. Among them was a young family with a newborn baby whose constant crying drew worried glances from the other passengers, and a group of 3 scientists who claimed to be working on a cure for the zombie plague, their expensive equipment and confident manner setting them apart from the other ragged survivors who had gathered at the crossing point. Emma found herself drawn to the baby, her maternal instincts awakening as she helped the exhausted mother care for the infant, while David examined the ferry's engines with a growing sense of unease, his mechanical expertise telling him that the boat was barely seaworthy and might not survive the crossing if anything went wrong. The ferry's departure began peacefully enough, with Captain Torres skillfully navigating the strong current while her passengers worked together to manage the boat's primitive systems. But the tranquility was shattered when zombies that had been lying dormant on the riverbed began responding to the noise and vibration of the ferry's engines, their waterlogged bodies rising from the depths like nightmarish mermaids to claw at the boat's hull. The attack came from all sides as the undead creatures climbed aboard with surprising agility, their waterlogged flesh making them even more horrifying than their land-dwelling counterparts, and the ferry's passengers found themselves fighting for their lives on a platform that was taking on water and slowly sinking toward the river bottom. It was during this desperate battle that Torres revealed her true nature, laughing maniacally as she explained that she had been using the ferry to feed survivors to the river zombies for months, trading human lives for safe passage through territories controlled by the undead, her madness evident in the way she seemed to enjoy watching her passengers fight for their lives against impossible odds. The remaining survivors were forced to work together in ways they had never imagined, with Marcus and the scientists using their combined knowledge to create makeshift weapons and defensive strategies, while Sarah and Emma protected the baby and its parents from the relentless assault of the water zombies, and David desperately worked to keep the ferry's engines running even as the boat listed dangerously to one side. The crossing became a nightmare of survival that tested every skill and ounce of courage they possessed, and by the time they reached the western shore, nearly half of the passengers had been lost to the hungry waters, their screams echoing across the river as a reminder that even in a world overrun by the dead, the greatest monsters were often those who had once been human, and the price of survival sometimes included witnessing horrors that would haunt their dreams for whatever remained of their lives. The coordinates they had risked everything to reach led them through a series of military checkpoints and razor wire barriers to what appeared to be their salvation, a sprawling compound of prefabricated buildings and watchtowers surrounded by electrified fences, where uniformed soldiers with clean weapons and well-fed faces processed streams of incoming refugees with the mechanical efficiency of a factory assembly line. Marcus felt his hopes soar as he watched children playing in a designated recreation area while their parents worked in organized groups, the sight of normalcy and order providing a stark contrast to the chaos and horror they had endured during their journey across the zombie-infested wasteland that America had become. The intake process seemed thorough but reasonable, with medical examinations to ensure no one was infected, skill assessments to determine where each survivor could best contribute to the community, and orientation sessions that explained the rules and expectations of their new home, but there were subtle details that made Marcus's combat instincts whisper warnings he tried desperately to ignore. General Morrison, the compound's commanding officer, presented himself as a benevolent leader who had created a sanctuary where survivors could rebuild their lives and contribute to humanity's future, his polished uniform and confident manner projecting an authority that seemed almost godlike to people who had spent months living in constant fear of death. During the orientation, he explained that everyone in Haven had a role to play, from the doctors and engineers who maintained their advanced systems to the laborers who ensured their food production and security operations continued without interruption, and Marcus found himself assigned to the medical facility where his army training would be put to use treating the various injuries and illnesses that plagued the refugee population. Sarah was placed in the education department, where she would teach the compound's children alongside other former educators who had found their way to this promised land, while David was assigned to the motor pool, where his mechanical expertise would help maintain the vehicles and generators that kept their civilization running smoothly. Emma was enrolled in what Morrison called the Youth Development Program, a comprehensive education and training initiative designed to prepare the next generation for leadership roles in their rebuilt society, but the teenager's sharp instincts immediately detected something unsettling about the program's emphasis on loyalty, obedience, and the absolute authority of the compound's leadership structure. The separation of their group during processing was presented as a necessary part of their integration into the community, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it was actually a deliberate strategy to prevent them from maintaining the bonds that had kept them alive during their journey, isolating them from each other and making them more dependent on the compound's systems and authorities. The work assignments were demanding and strictly scheduled, leaving little time for personal relationships or private conversations, and Marcus began to notice that the longer-term residents of the compound had a hollow, defeated look in their eyes that reminded him of prisoners rather than grateful survivors who had found salvation. Sarah's teaching duties revealed the first concrete evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with Haven when she discovered that the educational curriculum was heavily focused on propaganda that portrayed Morrison as humanity's savior and the compound as the only legitimate authority in a world gone mad, while discouraging critical thinking or questions about the leadership's decisions and policies. David's work in the motor pool brought him into contact with maintenance crews who whispered about disciplinary relocations of people who had violated the compound's strict behavioral codes, and he learned that questioning the system or expressing dissatisfaction with conditions could result in immediate transfer to specialized work details, from which no one ever seemed to return. Emma's experience in the youth development program was even more disturbing, as she discovered that the older teenagers were being trained not just in useful skills but also in surveillance techniques designed to monitor and report on the activities and conversations of their families and peers, creating a network of informants that ensured Morrison's control over every aspect of life within the compound. The revelation that Haven was actually a sophisticated prison disguised as a sanctuary came when Marcus was assigned to treat a patient who had been severely beaten for attempting to escape, the man's broken bones and infected wounds telling a story of systematic brutality that was carefully hidden from the newer residents who might still harbor illusions about their supposed freedom. The compound's true nature became undeniably clear when Sarah discovered that several of her fellow teachers had simply vanished after expressing concerns about the educational content they were required to deliver, and David learned from a terrified mechanic that the compound's leadership regularly eliminated people who possessed skills or knowledge that might threaten their absolute authority, maintaining their power through a careful balance of useful survivors and disposable labor that could be replaced whenever new refugees arrived seeking the salvation that would ultimately become their doom. The opportunity for escape came during what Morrison's forces called a routine perimeter breach, but Marcus recognized the zombie attack on the compound's outer defenses as anything but routine when he noticed that the electrified fences had been mysteriously disabled in several key locations, creating convenient entry points that suggested the breach had been deliberately orchestrated by the general himself. The attack began at dawn with a horde of zombies streaming through the compromised sections of the perimeter, their moans and snarls creating a chaos that Morrison would later use to justify the elimination of undesirable elements within the compound's population, a twisted form of population control that used the undead as unwitting executioners in his ongoing campaign to maintain absolute power over the survivors under his command. Marcus had been planning their escape for weeks, carefully mapping the compound's security protocols and identifying the weaknesses in Morrison's system, but the zombie breach forced him to accelerate his timeline and improvise solutions to problems he hadn't fully solved, knowing that the confusion and panic would provide cover for their breakout attempt even as it multiplied the dangers they would face. Sarah had spent her time in the education department building a network of allies among the other teachers and parents who shared her growing horror at the compound's true nature, and when the zombies breached the perimeter, she immediately began implementing the evacuation plan they had secretly developed, leading groups of children through maintenance tunnels and emergency exits while their parents created diversions to draw attention away from the escape routes. David's sabotage of the motor pool was a masterpiece of mechanical warfare, as he systematically disabled vehicles and communication equipment while appearing to help with the compound's defense, his actions creating a cascade of failures that would prevent Morrison's forces from pursuing the escaping survivors or calling for reinforcements from other military installations that might be operating in the region. Emma had discovered that several other teenagers in the youth development program shared her suspicions about Morrison's true intentions, and she led them in a coordinated rebellion that involved seizing control of the compound's communication center and broadcasting warnings to other refugee groups about the true nature of the supposed sanctuary. The escape plan began to unravel when Collins, the man they had rescued from Rodriguez's vehicle graveyard, was discovered to be working as an informant for Morrison's security forces, his betrayal exposing their carefully planned operation and forcing them to abandon their methodical approach in favor of a desperate run through the compound's corridors while zombies poured through the breached perimeter and Morrison's soldiers tried to maintain order through increasingly brutal tactics. Marcus found himself fighting a two-front war as he battled both zombies and human guards while trying to reach the medical facility where he had hidden supplies and equipment that would be essential for their survival in the wilderness beyond the compound's walls, his military training serving him well as he navigated the chaos with deadly efficiency. The sound of gunfire echoed through the compound as Morrison's forces attempted to contain both the zombie breach and the growing rebellion among the survivors, creating a three-way battle that turned the supposed sanctuary into a war zone where distinguishing between friend and enemy became increasingly difficult in the smoke and confusion. Sarah's evacuation of the children became a harrowing journey through maintenance tunnels that had been flooded with sewage and debris, forcing her to carry the smallest children while leading the older ones through passages that seemed designed more for machinery than human passage, her teacher's instincts driving her to protect every child under her care even as her own safety became increasingly precarious. David's mechanical expertise proved crucial when the group reached the compound's main gate and discovered that Morrison had activated a lockdown protocol that sealed all exits with reinforced barriers, forcing the mechanic to jury-rig an explosive device from maintenance supplies and fuel that would blast open their path to freedom while potentially bringing down half the compound's security system. Emma's leadership of the teenage rebels evolved into something approaching military command as she coordinated their takeover of key strategic points within the compound, her youth and apparent innocence allowing her to move through areas where adults would have been immediately suspect. But her success in disrupting Morrison's operations came at the cost of making herself a primary target for the general's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control. The final phase of their escape required a choice that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They could save themselves and flee into the wilderness, or they could risk everything to help the other survivors escape Morrison's compound before the general implemented his final solution of eliminating everyone who might pose a threat to his authority, a decision that would test their humanity against their survival instincts and determine whether they were still the people they had been before the world ended, or whether they had become something harder and more ruthless in their struggle to stay alive in a reality where moral choices often carried deadly consequences. The journey to the Real Haven became a nightmarish gauntlet that tested every skill the survivors had learned during their months of struggle across the zombie-infested wasteland, as Morrison's forces pursued them relentlessly through treacherous mountain passes while massive hordes of undead converged on their location, drawn by the sounds of gunfire and the scent of the living that carried for miles on the thin mountain air. Marcus led their desperate caravan of rescued survivors through terrain that would have been challenging under the best circumstances, but with wounded children, elderly refugees, and limited supplies, every mile became a test of endurance and will that pushed them beyond their physical and emotional limits. Sarah had taken charge of organizing the medical care for their group, her teaching skills proving invaluable as she coordinated the efforts of volunteers who had never dealt with trauma wounds or zombie bites, while David worked tirelessly to keep their stolen vehicles running on mountain roads that seemed designed to destroy anything with wheels and an engine. Emma had emerged as a natural leader among the younger survivors, her courage during the escape from Morrison's compound earning her the respect and trust of teenagers who had learned to be suspicious of any adult authority, and she found herself making life-and-death decisions that would have overwhelmed someone twice her age as they navigated through territories where every shadow could hide either salvation or destruction. The Real Haven, when they finally reached it after 2 weeks of running battles and narrow escapes, was nothing like the militarized compound they had fled, but rather a network of interconnected mountain communities that had been carved into the living rock of the peaks themselves, their entrances hidden behind waterfalls and camouflaged openings that made them nearly invisible to both zombie hordes and hostile human forces. The people who greeted them at Haven's gates were armed but welcoming, their faces bearing the marks of hardship and loss but also the unmistakable signs of hope and determination that came from successfully building something positive in the midst of global catastrophe. The timing of their arrival could not have been worse, as Haven scouts reported that the largest zombie migration ever recorded was heading directly toward their mountain sanctuary, a moving sea of undead numbering in the hundreds of thousands that had been disturbed by Morrison's military operations and was now following the scent trails and sound echoes that led straight to the hidden communities that represented humanity's last hope for organized survival. Marcus found himself thrust into a leadership role within Haven's Defense Council, his military experience and recent encounters with both zombie hordes and human predators making him invaluable in planning the community's response to the approaching threat, while Sarah's educational background proved crucial in organizing evacuation procedures and emergency protocols for the civilian population. David's mechanical expertise became the foundation for Haven's engineering response to the crisis, as he worked with the community's technical teams to design and build defensive systems that could channel the zombie horde away from the populated areas while creating kill zones where the undead could be eliminated efficiently and safely. Emma's natural leadership abilities found their perfect expression in Haven's Youth Corps, where she helped train and organize the teenagers who would play crucial roles in the community's defense, her experience with Morrison's brutal regime providing valuable insights into both military tactics and the importance of maintaining moral principles even in the face of existential threats. The battle that followed was unlike anything they had faced during their journey, as the zombie migration crashed against Haven's defenses like a tide of death that seemed to have no end, testing every innovation and strategy the community had developed during years of careful preparation and forcing them to adapt and improvise in real time as the situation evolved beyond their worst-case scenarios. The survivors who had traveled so far to reach this sanctuary found themselves fighting alongside people who had become experts in the art of survival, their combined knowledge and determination creating a defense that was greater than the sum of its parts. The victory, when it finally came after 3 days of continuous battle, was not just a triumph over the zombie threat but a demonstration that humanity could still work together to achieve something greater than individual survival, that the bonds forged in adversity could become the foundation for rebuilding civilization in a form that was perhaps better than what had existed before the outbreak began. Marcus stood on the walls of Haven as the sun rose on their first day of genuine safety, watching Sarah teach a group of children in the community garden while David worked on plans for expanding their defensive systems. And Emma led a patrol of young scouts who were already planning expeditions to contact other survivor communities and expand the network of hope that Haven represented. The road that had brought them to this moment had been long and terrible, marked by loss and sacrifice in moments when their humanity had been tested to its breaking point, but it had also led them to discover strengths they never knew they possessed and to find a family among strangers who had become more precious than anything they had lost, proving that even in a world overrun by death, life would always find a way to endure and flourish.